My name is Officer Nathan Keller. I've been with the Fairview Police Department for about 6 years now. It's a small town in upstate New York, population maybe 10,000. Most people know each other here, and for the most part, things are quiet. It's the kind of place where kids still ride their bikes to school, and everyone waves at each other on the street. That's why I'll never forget what happened during the night shift on November 18th, 2 years ago. It started like any other shift. My partner, Dan Foley, and I were patrolling the northern edge of town, a stretch of road flanked by thick woods on one side and a scattering of old farmhouses on the other. It was close to midnight and the roads were deserted. I remember joking with Dan about grabbing a coffee from the 24-hour diner before heading back to the station. Then the call came in. It was the dispatcher, Megan, her voice unusually tense. She said a woman named Angela Hartman had called in, claiming someone was trying to break into her house. She lived on Birch Hollow Road, about 5 miles out of town. Birch Hollow wasn't a place we went to often. Just a few old houses scattered along a dead-end road deep in the woods. It was the kind of place where cell service dropped off completely and most people kept to themselves. Angela Hartman? Dan asked, grabbing the radio. She's the one with the old blue farmhouse, right? Yeah, that's her, Megan replied. But here's the thing. She says she's in the attic hiding, claims the guy's already inside the house. Dan and I exchanged a glance. Break-ins weren't unheard of, but someone actually getting inside while the homeowner was still there. That was rare for Fairview. We're on our way, I said, starting the car. The drive out to Birch Hollow was eerie. The road narrowed as we got closer, the trees on either side growing denser. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the usual small-town radio chatter had gone silent. We reached Angela's house around 12:20 a.m. It was an old, creaky farmhouse set back from the road, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The only light came from a single bulb over the front door. There was no sign of movement. Dan and I stepped out of the cruiser, flashlights in hand. The air was cold, and the silence felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. We'll check the perimeter first, Dan said. We split up, each taking a side of the house. My flashlight swept over the windows, but nothing looked out of place. No broken glass, no signs of forced entry. Still, something felt off. It was too quiet. When we met back at the front porch, Dan shrugged. Looks fine to me. You want to knock? I nodded, stepping up to the door. I knocked hard, calling out, Fairview Police! Angela Hartman, are you home? No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Angela, it's the police. If you're inside, let us know. Still nothing. Dan gave me a look, then reached for the doorknob. It turned easily, the door creaking open to reveal a dark, silent interior. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The furniture was old and covered in dust, and the air felt unnaturally cold. Angela? I called out, my voice echoing faintly. From somewhere upstairs we heard it, a faint, muffled sob. Dan and I froze, exchanging a quick glance. Then we moved, stepping carefully up the creaking staircase. The sobbing grew louder as we reached the second floor, but it didn't sound like it was coming from any of the bedrooms. The attic, Dan whispered, pointing to a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. I nodded, gripping my flashlight tighter. Dan pulled the ladder down, the old wood groaning under the weight. The sobbing stopped. Angela? I called again, my voice shaking slightly. No answer. Dan climbed up first, his flashlight sweeping over the attic. I followed, and as soon as I stepped into the space, the smell hit me, a sickly metallic odor that made my stomach turn. The attic was small and cluttered with boxes and old furniture. In the far corner, we saw her, a woman huddled on the floor, her back to us, shoulders shaking. Ma'am, it's the police, Dan said gently, moving closer. But as he reached out to touch her shoulder, she suddenly bolted upright and turned to face us. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, her face streaked with tears. She looked terrified. He's still here, she whispered. Dan and I spun around, flashlights darting across the attic. but it was empty. "Ma'am, there's no one here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No," she insisted, her voice rising. "He was right there. He followed me into the attic. I swear." Dan shot me a look, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. Maybe she'd imagined it. Stress can do that to people, right? But then we heard it, a loud crash from downstairs, like something heavy being thrown to the floor. Dan and I bolted back down the ladder, weapons drawn. The living room was a mess. Furniture was overturned and the coffee table was shattered. But there was no sign of anyone. "Check the kitchen," I said, my heart pounding. Dan nodded, moving toward the back of the house. I stayed in the living room, scanning every corner. That's when I saw it. A muddy footprint near the front door. "Dan," I called, my voice tight. He came back, his face pale. "Kitchen's clear. What is it?" I pointed to the footprint. It was fresh. We didn't find anyone that night. We searched the entire house, the yard, even the woods surrounding the property. But whoever had been there, if anyone, was gone. Angela moved out of that house a week later. She couldn't stay, not after what happened. And honestly, I don't blame her. To this day, I still don't know what we walked into that night. But every time I drive past Birch Hollow Road, I feel it. The same heavy silence, the same uneasy tension. And I wonder, what if we'd been just a few minutes earlier?